Okay, today we'll learn how to add percent, and this entails knowing the 1% rule and the 10% rule. So going up at the top, we can say that 1% is the same thing as 1 over 100. So, if we want to say what's 1% of 20, 1% is 1 over 100 times, and then of is times, so 1 over 100 times 20. Well, that would be 1 times 20 is 20. That's 20 over 100. And 20 divided by 100, you can see that 10 goes into both of these, so it's 2/10. And how do you write 2/10 as a decimal? The decimal point goes right there. 0.2. That's 2/10. So 1% of 20 is 0.2. All right, now let's go to the 10%. 10% can be written as 10 out of 100. And of course that can be reduced, because 10 goes into both of these, to 1/10. So 10% is the same thing as 1/10. All right, well, so if I take 10% of 20, 10% is 1/10 times of is times 20. So let's multiply that out, and that's like having a 1 under it. So 1 times 20 is 20. 10 times 1 is 10. And of course you can see that 10 goes into both of these, right? So I can just cross those off. So we have 2 divided by 1, which is just 2. So where's the decimal point? Right there. Excuse me, right there. Okay, so now let's take a look. 1%, for 1%, it's 0.2. We had 20, and that's 0.2. And for 10%, for 20, it becomes 2. Now, if you want to, I'll put a 0 here. That may look a little bit easier for you. Now, look where the decimal was, and look where it went to. It was here, and now it moved over 2 spaces. And then for 10%, it was there, and it moved over 1 space. So you can see that to find 1% of 20, all we did is just move the decimal over. And to find 10%, again, all we did is just move the decimal over. And for 1%, we moved the decimal over 2 spaces. Let's write that down for our rule. Okay, so for the 1% rule, to find 1% of a number, move the decimal. Move decimal. How many spaces did we move it? 2 spaces. Move the decimal 2 spaces. Let's do some examples like that. Okay, so for 1%, we need to move the decimal 2 spaces. So 36 would become 0.36. See, I'm moving over 2 spaces. That's 1% of 36 is 0.36. 1% of 22, again, move the decimal over 2 spaces, 0.22. All right, 1% of 84, again, move the decimal over 2 spaces, 0.84. For the number 8, move the 1% of 8, move the decimal over, again, 2 spaces, so it is 0.08. And then for 3, 1% of 3, move it over 2 spaces, and it becomes 0.03. Okay, so that's how you find 1% of a number. Just move the decimal over 2 spaces, and that's 1% of a number. Okay, now let's move on to the 10% rule. Well, to find 10%, we have to move the decimal. How many spaces? Only one space. So that S should not be there. Only one space. Because remember, for the number 20, it just moved over one space for 10%. All right, so let's go ahead and do some examples of that. Okay, I want 10% of 49. Well, we moved the decimal just one space, so it becomes 4.9. Okay, for 65, 10% of that is 6.5. So 10% of $65 is $6.50. Okay, 10% of 18, move the decimal one space, it's 1.8. 10% of 7, move the decimal one space, is 0.7. And 10% of 5, move the decimal over, is 0.5. All right, so that's how we find 10%. Just move the decimal one space. And one thing I do to help memorize this, like how do you know if you move one or two spaces? All right, well, this is how I remember it. 1 cent. Here's 1 cent. Okay, 1 cent, 1%. Notice that the 1 is 2 spaces over from the decimal. That's how I remember 2 spaces. Okay, and then 10 cents, the 1, 10%, the 1 is only 1 space from the decimal. And this is how, and this is how I memorize it. This is 2 spaces from the decimal, this is 1 space from the decimal. And that's how I know how many spaces to move it. Okay, let's go back to our notes at the very bottom. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to be adding percent. So let's first of all, let's find 1% of 34. Okay, the decimal is right there. It's 34. Excuse me. To find 1%, I have to move the decimal over 2 spaces. Okay, so this means it's going to be 0.34. And to find 10%, I would just move it over 1 space. Right? 10% of 34 is 3.4. Okay, let's try it again. Let's move on to the next one, number 22. Okay, 1% of 22, you have to move here's the decimal. You have to move it over 2 spaces. So it's 0.22. All right, and to find 10%, you move the decimal over 1 space, so it's actually 2.2. Let's move on. Okay, 44. There's the decimal there. To find 1%, you have to move it over 2 spaces. So that'd be 0.44. And if you want just 10%, you move it over 1 space for 0.4. Okay, again, here's a decimal for 6. To find 1%, you have to move it over 2 spaces. So it's going to be 0.06. If you want 10% of 6, you move it over 1 space, so it is 0.6. Notice that 1% is smaller than 10%, 0.066. Okay, and the last one here, 2, there's the decimal there. For 1%, you move it over 2 spaces, so it's going to be 0.02. And then for 10%, move it over 1 space, so it's actually just 0.2. Right? Because you move it over there, it's 0.2. All right. Now that we've done that, here's the trick about percentages like this, 10%, 1%. You can actually add percentages. So if I wanted to find 11% of a number, 11%. Then all I have to do is add 1% and 10% together to get 11%. In other words, I can add these two numbers together and get 11% of 34. Okay, so let's try that. So if I add these together, I'll get 11% of 34. So if I do that, that's 374. So notice that 11% of 34 is 3.74. How do you find that? You can use 1% and 10% and add them together. Next one, to find 11%, I'm just going to add 1% and 10% together. Add these together. That's 2.42, excuse me. Okay, the next one, to find 11%, add these two together. 4.84. Okay, you want 11% of 6. Add the 10%, 1% together. That's 0.66. So if it's $6, 11% would be 66 cents. And if you had $2, 11% would be 10% and 1% together. That would be 22 cents, 0.22. So you have to keep the decimal lined up whenever you're adding. Just one last quick example, not on your notes, but on here. If you're asked to find 3% of 21, what you can do is find 1% of 21. Okay, so 1% of 21, I just move the decimal 2 spaces. And what I would do is go ahead and add that 3 times. Just add that up. And that's 3, that's 6.63. Okay, so 3% of 21 is 0.63. That's like saying 3% of $21 is 63 cents. So remember, for 1%, move the decimal 2 spaces, 10%, move it over 1 space.